Special guest brought to you by Bet Online. Check out Bet Online for updated college football playoff and conference championship game lines. It is Danny Kanell from the other Danny and Dusty that's out there. Danny, how you doing today?
What is up, fellas? It's great to be back on. I believe the last time I spoke with you guys, I was in Central Park in New York City when I was speaking to you last time. This time I'm back home in South Florida. But it's good to be on with you, man. Conference championship weekend. It should be fun.
Look, all eyes here locally are on the Big Ten championship game. Penn State, Oregon in Indianapolis coming up this Saturday. And Oregon is a 3.5-point favorite is kind of where this line opened up at. It got bumped up to 4, went back down to 3.5. As you look at this matchup between the Ducks and the Nittany Lions, you have the number one team in the country who has a win at home over Ohio State, and Penn State, who they have their one loss is to the same team that Oregon beat, but it was at home against the Buckeyes. Are you surprised at the 3.5-point line, and how do you see this game playing out?
No, I think it's pretty tight. I think this number is probably spot on about where I'd have it. And I know that because I'm sitting there looking at it feeling really tempted to take Penn State with that field goal number, that 3, especially with that hook on it, feeling like there's some pretty good value on the Nittany Lions. And all that being said, I've had Oregon to win the national championship. I think they're the best team in college football, but I think this will be one of their bigger tests. I mean, clearly it's their biggest test since they played against Ohio State at home. I'll actually be at the game in Indy. I think it'll be a pretty good crowd for Penn State. I don't know if the Oregon faithful will travel because of the dynamic that unfolds. Like, do you want to go to this game, or do you want to save your money, potentially go to a quarterfinal or a semifinal game or the national championship? Like, it gets expensive. But I think probably, the physicality of Penn State will be the thing that I'll be keeping an eye on. Like, is Oregon's offensive line, which has been so good, are they able to establish that run game with Jordan James, get him going against the Penn State front, which is pretty intimidating, pretty daunting, and they do love to blitz a lot to get after the passer. I think it's going to be a really fun matchup.
Yeah, I'm with you on this game is going to be a lot tighter than I think a lot of people, because there's this narrative with Penn State that the big game and the big matchup and James Franklin doesn't rise to the occasion. This team feels different this year, though. That game against Ohio State, it could have gone either way. I mean, we're just talking about down on the goal line, and Penn State's got an opportunity, and they unable to punch it in. That front seven for Penn State, it's nasty this year. And with Oregon, it is, can they establish the run and kind of lean on Penn State as they have with every other team this year? What have you seen from Penn State in that front seven on the defensive side that is going to keep this game close?
Well, first of all, if you're Dillon Gabriel or anybody that's carrying the football, but specifically Dillon Gabriel as the quarterback, you want to make sure you know where Abdul Carter is. He's one of the best pass rushers in the country. I mean, he just flat out gets after it. Their linebacking core, Colby King and Tony Rojas, are really pretty stout. Like, it is a physical front. So and I thought the thing that you hit on there right there, because Oregon feels to me like they've been leaning on the run a little bit more as of late. And I think it's a great, it's a physical game, right? The more physical team wins most of the time. But I do feel like since that game against Ohio State, it's been more business-like, almost a little bit boring. Like taking care of your business. They haven't showed a lot. They haven't had to. The only scare was against Wisconsin. Other than that, it's been really dominant. What I'm kind of excited to see is, does Will Stein have something up his sleeve for a game like this where, if it is close and it is the fourth quarter, where you start pulling some tricks out of your bag and maybe start to stretch the field vertically more like you had to do against Ohio State, which they did. And then you guys know this as well. Getting back Tez Johnson to full health is probably another reason why they were able to run it and were focusing more on the run game. But with him back, I think they might even be able to throw the ball and supplement the run game with a quick pass game if they can't run it, just to kind of help them keep the down and distance in normal situations where it's 3rd and 3 or 4 as opposed to 3rd and 8 and 9. And I think that's where Dillon Gabriel's experience and knowledge and just his savvy of getting rid of the football, not taking sacks, will be critical in this game. Because this Penn State defense, they do thrive off getting to the passer and being disruptive, as was evidenced in that game against Washington We saw Oregon get all those sacks against Washington, but Penn State likes to get a lot of sacks too. They like to get after the quarterback.
Ty Warren may be one of my favorite players in all of college football with just the way that they use him on the offensive side of the ball. He's a battering ram. They use him as a receiver, running the football. He is fun, but Drew Aller is the guy that is his career over the last 2 years been much maligned, and especially against top 20 defenses where he's averaging only 56 completion percentage, 150 yards per game through the air against top 20 defenses over the last 2 years. What do you think of Drew Aller, and if this game gets tight, have you seen growth in him and his game to kind of put a team on his back and carry him?
No, I haven't. And, I guess the one game where I thought he was going to take the next step was the USC game. He was 30 of 43. He threw for almost 400 yards, but he also had 3 interceptions, and 200 plus of those yards went to Tyler Warren, their superstar tight end that you mentioned. But, over the course of time, Drew Aller needs to take that next step. And, this is the type of game where your quarterback has to be a difference maker. You can't be just a game manager. Earlier this season, if you're playing against Illinois, which is a good team but not a great team, he can manage the game, not make the big mistake. But we saw it against Ohio State. That was the game you needed him to step up and make some big plays, and he just couldn't. I was there 2 years ago in Columbus watching him go against Ohio State. Same thing. For whatever reason, is it his supporting cast? Is it his wide receivers that they don't really have an alpha wide receiver? Is that it? Or is it just a Drew Aller problem? He needs to jump in and take that next step, extend plays, make those big plays when there's nothing there to be had. That is a huge advantage that I think Oregon has going for it, is they have a massive advantage, Dillon Gabriel over Drew Aller. Drew Aller is right now a game manager, and that's not good enough to win games and to win several games to win a national championship for Penn State.
Danny Kanell is our guest. He's courtesy of betonline.net. We're talking conference championship weekend. And Danny, I love the back and forths that you're not afraid to get into with people on Twitter about the ACC. And look at you. You've got the cards of the CFP.
Much like our other Danny.
Yeah, the cards of the CFP are in the ACC's hands this weekend, where you have SMU and Clemson. Miami is a 2-loss team that a lot of people are writing off. How does this weekend play out for the ACC?
Oh, boy. It's funny because this season has been such a roller coaster ride. We went from having potentially, the push was 6 SEC teams about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Then it went to 3. And then while Georgia was getting beat by Georgia Tech, my jaw dropped when I heard Jesse Palmer say they could be looking at only 1 SEC team had Georgia lost that game. But we know that Georgia won in 8 overtimes, so it does feel like 3 are locked from the SEC, and then it feels like, all right, so here's the thing on the ACC. 1 is a lock, right? The conference champion is going to get in. But I feel like the best case for them is that if Clemson wins the ACC, I don't see how they drop SMU out of the playoff. As it sits now, SMU in the AP is 8. We'll see where they come out tonight. I would imagine worst case it would be 9. But, if you're going to punish a team for playing in a conference championship game, I think that sends a really bad message when you've got teams like Notre Dame, when you've got teams like Tennessee, when you've got teams like Ohio State with 2 losses, get to sit at home with their feet up on the couch, not subject themselves to a loss, and get healthy and essentially a bye while you punish a team for making the conference championship game. I think that's a horrible message, and I think most people agree SMU is in even with a loss. So then you'd have Clemson, SMU for sure. That's the best case to get 2. And then you mentioned Miami, who I think is a trendy pick. The thing that's killing Miami is the recency bias. They've lost 2 out of their last 3, but if you separate what has happened lately and just looked at it on paper, which is the committee's job is supposed to do that, even though we all know it's impossible, their losses are not bad. Their losses are to good teams. Georgia Tech on the road by a field goal. They lost to Syracuse, again, another tight loss, who's finished the season 9-3. They're both road losses, and they're both not awful teams that they lost to. And then they beat teams like Louisville. They've smoked the Florida Gators from the SEC, where that win actually looks better now than it did for Miami. And they're 10-2. And then you stack Miami's resume against those 3 9-3 teams. Here's where I think might actually help Miami. If the committee is looking at those 3-loss SEC teams And it's like impossible to pick the right one. Like, do you go with Ole Miss? Do you go with Alabama? Or do you go with South Carolina? They all have flaws. Or do you offend one of them? Or do you just say, you know what? We can't make up our minds. We'll put Miami in ahead of them. That, I think, is the best case scenario for the ACC to get 3. I think the more likelihood is 2, but you are correct. They could be looking at just 1 if SMU wins and and Miami's on the outside looking in. They could be only 1, but I think 2 might be where they end up.
Georgia, Texas is intriguing to me because of the way that game played out in Austin earlier in the season. Now you have a neutral site. We use the air quotes on that in Atlanta.
Yeah.
Oregon knows all about playing Georgia at a neutral site in Atlanta. It is going to be
very neutral.
It is going to be red and black through and through in that stadium. Georgia has had their warts over the course of this year. Obviously, we saw them with that 8 overtime game against Georgia Tech where they end up pulling out a victory there. How do we see this playing out with Quinn Ewers, who has been a little bit of a roller coaster, but they're leaning on their defense in Austin this season?
They really are, and that was on full display in College Station where they got the best of Texas A&M. Excuse me. I'm surprised that Texas is a favorite here. Like, we saw this game like 6 weeks ago in Austin, and we saw Georgia beat Texas down, like physically manhandle them, and not to forget, Carson Beck looked awful in that game.
Yep.
Georgia's quarterback threw 3 interceptions, and Georgia still beat them by 15 points. And yet now, all of a sudden, Georgia, they come limping in with that game against Georgia Tech, which, by the way, they did win. And by the way, they came back from 17-0. Like, I thought that was pretty impressive. And Texas comes in with that dominant defense. So I look at this game, and I kind of like Georgia. You mentioned it. It's a huge home field advantage for them to play in Atlanta. It's their backyard, especially, again, kind of similar dynamic as the Big Ten championship game. Like, if you're a Texas fan, you're advancing no matter what. Do you want to pay to travel to Atlanta, or do you just want to wait and see what happens and then, go ahead and whatever the case is, go pay and watch a semifinal or a national championship game? But I think the physicality is the thing that's interesting because Georgia's defense dominated Texas's offensive line. Can Texas rebound? Are they that much different? And then the one thing that I think is interesting is Arch Manning, the superstar backup. He played in that game. Remember they took Quinn Ewers. That was the first time we saw him in meaningful snaps. But he also ran for a touchdown last week against Texas A&M. I think he's the wild card that Steve Sarkisian will go to generate some offense against that Georgia defense. So I think that Texas will stack up better, but not enough for me to back them as a favorite. So I like Georgia as the home underdog in that one, in a game we already saw unfold, saw them beat them. I like Georgia with the points.
Danny, before we let you go, I just got an overarching question about this college football playoff, the way that the rankings are right now. Do you like the format where the top 4 conference champions get a bye? And do you think we'll see a change in that as just being the top 4 teams in the rankings getting a first round bye?
Yeah, we'll definitely see a change. This is a 2-year experiment, and there are a couple things that if they unfold, who knows, we might see it blow up after 1, right? And I think that primarily is if Boise State has a first-round bye over a Big 12 champion. We'll see if that actually ends up happening. But I think it's been a shock to the system to a lot of people to see Boise State with a first-round bye as these rankings have unfolded. I was a massive proponent of expansion. I think it's been awesome for the sport. I think the teams on the bubble that have never even been able to sniff the playoffs, I think it's great, like South Carolina, SMU, Indiana, teams that would have been on the outside. The fact that they're going to get a chance to play for it, I think is awesome. The one thing that I think we need to fix, and I don't know how we do it, is you're going to see, again, I kind of alluded to it when we were talking about the conference championship game loser like SMU. How do you penalize teams that accomplish something that other teams didn't? And you're going to let those teams that didn't accomplish the regular season success, you're going to let them play for a title, and then you're going to send those other teams that played in conference championship games home. Like, and I'm sure the Big Ten championship loser is going to be fine. The SEC championship games loser is going to be fine. But what about the ACC and the Big 12? Like, it's a weird dynamic, and I don't know how we fix it because the conference championship games are a big moneymaker. They're not going to go away. And then the seeding. So I am actually okay the way it is with the seeding. Like, hey, the first 4 are the highest ranked conference champions are there. I think that really does put a premium on winning your conference championship. But what I am concerned about is what do they do to punish the teams that lose in those? Even seeding, like if you have to go on the road as opposed to hosting a home game, if you were a team that didn't have to play on conference championship game, I think that's a weird dynamic.
Yeah.
So I think there's some things that they'll fix and they'll address. But I do love it, man. It's been awesome. This season has been so much fun. And I think with the portal and NIL, it's opened up things where we don't have that dominant team. I think Oregon is one of them, but I think there's about 12, 13 teams that could win this thing. And that hasn't been the case in the last 15 years of college football.
No doubt about it. Danny Kanell, he's courtesy of betonline.net, talking conference championship week and the college football playoff. All things college football. You can find Danny Kanell on Twitter at Danny Kanell. Dusty and Danny in the mornings, 3 to 6 a.m. our time. That's really early for our time. And on CBS Sports HQ. Thanks for the time, man. Really appreciate it.
You guys are the best, man. I'll talk to you soon. Have a good one.
And I'll see you in Indy. I'm going to be in Indy as well. So I'll see you in Indy.
Come up and say hello.
I absolutely will. Thanks, Danny.
Right.
Danny
Bye-bye.
Kanell. That's good stuff from Danny Kanell on all things college football. And look, the big wild card is really the ACC and the cards that they hold.